"Shot between the eyes," said the medic, Riley adding, "He never saw it coming." Without another word, he moved on to the next wounded man. Behind him stood General Stephen Watts Kearny, commander of the Army of the West, charged with securing California for the United States. He looked down at Captain Abraham Robinson Johnston, his aide-de-camp, his loyal companion since the 2,000-mile march from Fort Leavenworth. There might have been a flicker of sorrow, but there was no time for it. Duty called, and no tear would bring him back. The Battle of San Pasqual, fought in the cold pre-dawn of December 6, 1846, marked the first major clash between American and Mexican troops in California, and had gone terribly wrong. 21 killed, 15 wounded. But it wasn't supposed to be this way. It was only a few months earlier, after the bloodless conquest of New Mexico, that Captain Johnston had written in his diary, "Had Armijo's heart been as stout as the walls of rock, every inch of ground from the Raton to Santa Fe might have been disputed. But Armijo had fled, and before the sun went down, the Star-Spangled Banner was waving from the abandoned mansion of the late governor of New Mexico." Brimming with confidence, the Army of the West departed for California, following the Gila River westward, hoping for another swift victory. But along the way, General Kearny received unexpected news from famed mountain man Kit Carson, who was en route to Washington, D.C. Carson told Kearny that Captain John C. Fremont and Commodore Robert F. Stockton had already declared California subdued. Well, that changed everything. With that, Kearny sent part of his command back to New Mexico and pressed on with a smaller force. His new plan, to link up with Fremont and Stockton and officially proclaim the conquest complete. To say that plan didn't work out would be an understatement of southwestern proportions. To understand how victory turned to defeat, we have to look at what happened in between. By December 5th, the Army of the West had encamped at Santa Maria, about 40 miles northeast of San Diego. That evening, under cover of darkness, Captain Archibald Gillespie of the California Volunteers rode in to join them. He brought urgent news. An armed party of Californios, under General Andres Pico, was camped at the nearby village of San Pasqual, roughly 9 miles away, directly on the road to San Diego. Apparently, Pico and his men had not been informed that California had been subdued. General Kearny had hoped to avoid bloodshed, especially after the peaceful conquest of New Mexico. But that hope was gone. The road to San Diego was the road to battle. At first light, they would strike. The next morning, Kearny ordered his men to advance at a trot, to form up and face the California cavalry. But in this unfamiliar country, confusion reigned. Captain Johnston, leading the forward column, misheard the command. Drawing his saber, he shouted, "Charge!" He spurred ahead, only to be struck by a bullet square between the eyes. In an instant, becoming the first American officer to fall in the California theater. The charge collapsed. The line broke. San Pasqual descended into chaos. When the skirmish finally ended, they had been soundly beaten. Dead bodies lay scattered about. As one soldier later recalled, the howling of wolves echoed through the valley, drawn by the smell. Kearny, himself wounded, ordered the bodies gathered. At first, he intended to bring them to San Diego for burial. But the mules were too few and too lame to carry both the wounded and the dead. So he issued a new order. The men of the Army of the West dug a mass grave beneath a willow tree. And there, beneath its leaves, they buried their dead. With nothing left to do, they packed up, and with San Diego still days away, they marched on. This was the first time that Captain Johnston would be buried. Abraham Robinson Johnston was one of 15 children, born to John Johnston, an Irish immigrant who settled in Piqua, Ohio, and his Pennsylvania-born Quaker wife, Rachel Robinson. At 15, young Abraham entered West Point, determined to pursue a military career, a decision his father wholeheartedly endorsed. He graduated in 1834 and was assigned to duty on the western frontier, where he seemed destined to remain a career soldier. In 1842, his father offered him a small plot of land, a cabin to call his own, should he ever wish to settle down. Johnston's reply was brief but telling. In reply to your kind offer of a log cabin, I have only to say yes. By 1845, he had completed 10 years of service and was preparing to leave the Army. A good wife was high on the list, but those plans would have to wait. In 1846, Kearny, then a colonel, ordered him to report to Fort Leavenworth at once. The country was at war, and that is how Captain Johnston came to be in Mexico. Before his candle was extinguished at San Pasqual, he climbed a hill near Warner's Rancheria, gazed westward, and believed he saw, for the first time, the distant shimmer of the Pacific Ocean. He wrote to his father that he hoped, one day, to stand upon its shore. The march towards San Diego was no walk in the park. It was survival, cut off from supplies, and pinned down near Mule Hill. General Kearny sent Kit Carson and 2 companions through enemy lines with a message to Commodore Stockton at San Diego, requesting reinforcements. 2 days later, Stockton received the plea and dispatched a relief column of just over 200 sailors and Marines. When the Californios learned that reinforcements were approaching on December 11th, they withdrew. At last, the tattered remnant of the Army of the West staggered into San Diego, wounded but alive. Soon after, with Kearny and Stockton's combined forces, the U.S. military secured control of California. On January 13, 1847, the capitulation of Cahuenga was signed, ending hostilities between American forces and the Californios. From that moment, California was under American control, a possession in fact, if not yet by law. Upon learning of his son's death, John Johnston petitioned the Army to return the body to Ohio, so that Abraham could be laid to rest in the family plot. If he would not live in the log cabin that had been set aside for him, he would at least rest within its grounds, a request the Army readily agreed to honor. In April of 1848, 16 months after his death, the bodies of Captain Johnston and his comrades were exhumed from their shallow grave beneath the willow tree and reinterred in the military burial ground at San Diego. It was Abraham's second burial, and though he had hoped to look upon the Pacific with open eyes, he finally rested within sight of it, with them closed. The War Department informed John that a special duty officer would depart New York for California that December for the express purpose of recovering Captain Johnston's remains. They further assured Johnston that identifying his son's grave would pose little difficulty, since officers had been buried apart from enlisted men. In all likelihood, the body would be exhumed once more and sent to San Francisco. From there, it would be transported to New York and carried onward to Piqua, Ohio, where at last, Abraham Robinson Johnston could return home. The officer expected the assignment to take 6 months. 2 years later, roughly 38 months after his son's death, in February 1850, the Adjutant General of the U.S. Army received another letter from John Johnston. Turns out the Army had reneged on its promise. Abraham's body had never been sent home. The last word Johnston had received, dating back to late 1848, reported that the duty officer assigned to recover the remains had died of cholera en route to California. Nothing more had transpired. All Johnston knew was that his son still lay buried in a makeshift military cemetery somewhere outside San Diego. I now earnestly invoke the interposition of your department to aid me in a duty nearer to my heart than all others, he wrote, pleading for his son's return. And, just in case they could not identify the body, Johnston made it easy for them. Abraham was shot in the head, the other officers being killed by lances. Embarrassed by its long mismanagement, the Army finally complied. Abraham Robinson Johnston's remains were returned to Piqua, where he was laid to rest in the family plot on April 15, 1852. It was the third and last time he would be buried. Or so we believe. That should have been the final, solemn chapter. But history is rarely neat and tidy. A story later emerged that sometime in 1852, workers in an Army surplus store in San Francisco made a grisly discovery. In the basement, a wooden box. Inside, the remains of a U.S. Army officer. A hole in the skull, clean between the eyes, identified as having fallen at the Battle of San Pasqual. Somewhere along the way, after the exhumation in San Diego and the shipment north, the Army had made a ghastly mistake. They had switched the coffin meant for Ohio, with a box containing an iron stove. The stove went to the grieving family. The body stayed behind. Too embarrassed to admit the error, the Army quietly buried the remains. And so, the real Captain Johnston may have been laid to rest at the Presidio of San Francisco. If this apocryphal tale holds even a fragment of truth, it will mean Johnston was buried not 3 times, but 4. More than a century later, in the 1970s, intrigued by the rumor, local historians brought a metal detector to Abraham's grave in Piqua. The needle spiked wildly, as if a great hunk of metal lay beneath the headstone. Captain Johnston never saw the Pacific in life. But if the legend is true, his bones, or what should have been his bones, rest within sight of it still. An officer who led the charge misheard the order and became the first casualty of California's conquest, buried once beneath a willow, twice beneath the weight of error, thrice in silence. And perhaps his headstone in Piqua is burying an Army surplus stove.